Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all of the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies. It's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others. Today, we're going to do something a little different and have a short discussion about AI and how it is permeating almost every conversation that Paul and I are having in our day-to-day work. We wanted to share some thoughts on how the conversation about AI is progressing in the charity sector and compare it with what's being seen in the private sector.
And it's a topic that this podcast has covered in the past. Our listeners are probably like, oh, another section on AI. We did an interview recently with Tim Cook of AI Confident, and that episode is probably the one that I've had most comment about in the past few months.
Oh, interesting.
Actually, Paul, that was a really sensible conversation about AI. It was something that they hadn't heard before. There was a lack of hyperbole behind it as well. So I think Tim was a great, safe pair of hands to guide us through that conversation. But as he said, it's starting to permeate into almost everything that we're doing. And you're doing quite significant work in the charity sector. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, sure. So maybe if I give a little bit of an overview of what's happening. So obviously one of the key things we work on is the Charity Digital Skills Report. We've been tracking AI adoption across the charity sector since 2023. And what we saw in the 2024 report, which came out in July, is that AI adoption has gone up really significantly. So that's one of the big takeaways from that report, that it's gone up from 35% in 2023 right up to 61% this year. So there's a lot happening. And certainly when I talk to charities day to day, the work that we're doing, and we are obviously doing AI projects and advising charities about that as much as the wider digital transformation piece, there's a lot of grassroots activity and innovation. But where I think there's some real challenge coming down the track is that we've got to move beyond grassroots innovation to more joined up strategic approaches. And that is equally true of what we do in our own organisations as much as across the sector. So what we saw in the report in July was that only 11% of charities are using AI tools across their organisation. So what that really means is there's a lot of charities who don't have that strategic change programme underpinning adoption of these tools, and 45% of charities are using these tools informally. So it's very kind of organic, very sort of grassroots, and that's exciting because that's where all this innovation is going to come into organisations, and we're already seeing that. But what it does mean is that it's also where risk is much more likely to creep in, because that learning and that experimentation isn't always happening in the open, because we really need leaders to get on board with this and for the right strategies and the right investment and the right decision making to support the innovation that staff are leading in this area.
And do you think it is being led by staff more than the software and the software vendors in the charity sector? Because I think it's slightly different from where I'm standing in that in the accounting world, for example, if you're talking about the private sector, in the accounting world, there are pieces of software that will run audits, for example, or help the organizations to run audits. And it's those software vendors that are fully embracing AI and bringing AI into the conversation about how it's going to be built into the tools and how it's going to affect the job of auditors, as one example. And that's where I think a lot of the change is being driven, because leaders of the firms are actually seeing those innovations and then thinking, well, how do we approach this? How do we approach it from a systems perspective rather than how can we experiment with it?
Yeah, so I think that's such an interesting comparison, and what that says to me, and obviously correct me if you have a different interpretation of it, is that that is a more mature market. Because if you've got to the point where you've got products embedded in service delivery, then of course leaders are going to be a bit more aware of what's happening, because they start to understand the tangible impacts of the business benefits. I don't think we're there yet as a charity sector. I think that there's absolutely a lot of need, as we can see in the report. There's certainly a lot of appetite. So any content, any event that we produce around AI, and I know this is the same for a lot of other organizations, it's really, really popular, and it's one of the big things that people want to talk to us about at the moment. So there's a lot going on, but I doesn't feel like it's a market yet, even though we are obviously doing AI projects. But I think there's a whole education and change piece which needs to happen in order for things to develop further. And obviously, leaders and trustees are going to be really fundamental to that, because they're the ones that are going to be signing off on investment, providing oversight, developing the strategy. So it's early doors, and I'm really interested to see how things evolve over the next year.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I don't think there is the maturity that we've sort of just described within the private sector. But what I do think is there is a definite, certainly within the regulated industries of accounting and accountancy and law, and there is a nervousness around how the tools are could be used from an experimentation point of view. A bit of nervousness around Copilot and being able to place IT teams being able to literally place their hands on where the data is held, and know that the data is being held securely and on premise in most instances, or in a secure cloud. Sorry. But a lot of nervousness around that being used in the workplace by teams. But you'll probably know, and you'll probably see as well, experimentation is happening, and it's happening in teams like marketing, communications, where teams are looking to AI to create a sort of the way that you and I would probably use it, almost as a sort of a virtual AI assistant. You pump some information into it, you get some information back, and then you use that as a starting point for a piece of writing or a piece of communication. And I think that side of things, seeing those teams experiment and seeing them want to use it, is driving an internal conversation around risk and around how that needs to be, how governance programs need to be put in. And that's definitely the case. But now I think the difference is that the operational changes that will be driven by the software that accountants and law firms use, and the efficiencies that can be gained through those platforms and through the use of AI within those platforms, is such that they can't help but ignore the systematic change that it's going to have for them, rather than the experimental. So I think it's this meeting of the two things. They know they need to experiment. They know they need to play around with the platforms in order to get used to what they can deliver. But the software vendors are showing them the future by implementing AI into the products today, and it's happening today. It's not something that we'd look in a 5-year strategy. We'd be looking at 3-4 years down the line. It's happening today, and it's being reflected in those strategies today, which I think has been a bit of a shift for the work that I'm doing.
See, I think this is so interesting, because some of the things that you've mentioned are definitely happening in the charity sector. It's just this sector seems to be responding differently. So I do know quite a lot of charities now who are using Copilot. We ourselves have a really good relationship with Microsoft, who I think are doing some really good work supporting the charity sector, and they also kindly supported the Digital Skills Report this year, so thank you to them. And obviously there are quite a lot of products out of enterprise software that have AI integrations, like Salesforce, for example. So that is happening. It's all coming into the tech stack that charities use. But I think the conversations that I'm seeing happening at leadership and board level, are just so different to the conversations I am having with people at staff level. And I guess I would sort of extend that right up to sort of head of digital, maybe like chief digital officer. And it's like two different time zones, to be honest with you. At the sort of staff level and sort of senior management and people who are in digital leadership roles, there's hunger, there's interest, there's appetite. People are doing stuff. They really are innovating. But then at leadership level, not always, but it's quite often the case. The conversations I'm having it's like 2019. It's things like, what is AI and why does it matter? And are my staff really using it? And I do wonder whether that's because there's so much on leaders' plates at the moment. I know so many charities where they are going, well, I don't even know if I'm going to be here in 6 months' time, and the cost of living crisis, and obviously the massive impact of the national insurance and minimum wage overhead that's just landed on the sector as part of the budget a few weeks ago. So it might be that there are lots of leaders who do really want to engage further with this stuff, but they're just literally trying to keep the lights on at the moment.
And do you think that's because they're not yet being shown or sold or having the benefits demonstrated to them clearly enough? Because I think we've had conversations on the podcast, haven't we, about AI. AI tends to be followed by a conversation about fear, and actually probably should be followed by a conversation about opportunity, cautious opportunity, because the reasons people are scared of this can't be ignored. And I think there's still this sense of, well, it will take jobs, and it will change jobs for sure. I had a conversation yesterday with an senior audit partner, and he was saying that it will change things. It will mean that the audit is done by a piece of software, and the responsible individual will then need to check the work of the AI, check the work of the computer. But it's effectively the work of a team is now done by one, or could be done by one machine, and that will change things. But it will still mean that those skills are needed. They're just needed in completely different ways to how they are used today. So I wonder whether that's part of it. Are they just not seeing the benefits yet, or being shown the benefits in the way that perhaps the private sector are starting to look at it, because there's such a sort of a drive around cost savings, efficiencies, doing things more effectively, faster, that sort of thing. I don't know.
It could well be, because what you've described there is obviously those fears about the workforce, right? Will we really need as many people? Do the people we will still have or even have now, have they got the right skills? Because they're going to have to work with these tools in order to deliver the right results for clients. And whilst I don't agree with some of the hyperbole you see in the press about it's going to take all of our jobs, jobs are going to change. They are already changing. Roles and responsibilities are already changing. And we're not having that workforce conversation in the charity sector yet. And we really, really should be, because other sectors are having that. And what you've described there in the world of accountants is what we should be discussing in the charity sector. What should our workforce look like in a few years' time? What skills do we need? How can we support people in making these transitions? Because there will still be jobs, there will still be a charity sector, but the workforce will, like every other sector, look different. And we need to start preparing for that. And the drive for that, without naming any names, I think it has got to come from some of the sector membership and infrastructure bodies.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly, just sort of, as you said that, I looked over to my other screen and saw the numbers that I'd done some pre-work on this and put some numbers in from the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, the ICAEW, and they are out there leading the charge on this and putting those numbers in front. I think just the number in front of me is that 38% of mid-tier firms surveyed recently by the ICAEW are investing in AI. So it's only 40%, leaves a big chunk open there. But at least that conversation is being led within the broader noise around the sector that the accountancy leaders are involved in. And I think the other interesting thing that's happening in the accountancy sector at the moment, which we have to link to the adoption of technology and AI, is there is a huge consolidation of the industry brought about by private equity investment and private equity money. There's Grant Thornton a couple of weeks ago was one that took on private equity investment and majority investment into the firm. The following week there was Evelyn Partners, who sold off their accounting team offer to private equity as well. And one of the reasons, or one of the drivers, one of the reasons this is happening is that private equity brings money and investment, money that can be invested in technology, in recruiting the best people. And AI is going to be a huge part of that transformation too. So those firms that are investing or taking private equity money in will be awash with money to invest in new technology and new processes and in streamlining everything and making everything, in inverted commas, better through technology and AI. So that sort of growing conversation in the industry as a whole, I guess, is there in a way that it doesn't seem to be yet within the charity sector. But hopefully that changes through the work that you are doing and others are doing to raise awareness of it.
Yeah, I do hope so. I mean, that's really interesting. I'm going to be keeping a really close eye on the accountancy sector now, thanks to your very helpful framing of all of that. Because what's also made me reflect on is it's sometimes easier to affect change when you can piggyback on other change. So the fact that there's all this private equity money going into the sector, I mean, I do think that, when you have that kind of level of investment, then that's inevitably going to shake things up and get people thinking about doing things differently. And obviously we haven't got that kind of cash injection coming into the charity sector because the business model is completely different. And that will be one of the things that will absolutely hold back digital and AI adoption. So we've got to find other ways to do this. And some of that will be about funders getting on board with this, because currently there are very few funders who are funding AI, let alone digital. So I really hope that will change. We know there's a very strong need for that. And we've seen that year on year in the digital skills report. But we also need to have that conversation about AI at leadership level. And what you described, where the ICAEW, that's really good leadership, right? Because they're really owning and driving and leading that conversation for leaders, by leaders. And they're sending out some really helpful signaling and positioning in terms of how they're doing that. And that's what we also need to see in the charity sector.
Yeah, and I think then sort of pushing it forwards, I guess what that then allows, having that conversation out there allows within the private sector for businesses to look at the potential for expansion and new service lines and new offerings based on the fact that they have this technology under the roof now. And there has been a significant shift in the last sort of, I guess, 5-10 years, but certainly the last 5 years around data as a service, for example, within the accountancy world. So how are we learning about data, big data, and our use of data in order to create new services wrapped around that for clients. So I guess there's an opportunity there for the charity world as well to look at, well, what are the ways that we're going to need to change in the future? What are the new services that our customers, and our donors, are going to expect? And how is that shifting? So that future looking, that forward thinking view of where change is coming and how this is going to be driven by the consumer, by customers, by donors, is something that I think I'm seeing businesses getting better equipped at. But it would seem to me that that's going to be a challenge for the charity world as well.
I mean, it'll be harder, but it's absolutely not impossible. And actually, I think there are lots of opportunities out there if you know where to look for them. So I was presenting at a roundtable at King's College London a few weeks ago, back in October, and there were some really brilliant partnerships springing up between the digital health academics there and charities, particularly in the mental health space, where they're looking at where AI can be used as part of service delivery. So whilst it's going to be challenging to develop something solely under your own steam as a charity, it absolutely is possible to partner with universities, to partner with corporates. But what I was saying actually to a client the other day, who's quite a well-known charity who are starting to move forward with AI, is that you've got to start the work of preparing for those partnerships now. So you might not be ready to give the green light to a partnership with, say, a university or a corporate, but it takes time to find the right partners, and you need to have the right ethical frameworks in place. You need to make sure your data is all up to scratch and kind of AI ready, really. So you want to make sure that you've put all of that spade work in to make sure your data's in the right places and you can do the right things with it in order to make the most of these relationships. And there could be some really interesting stuff that you could do around things like looking at. I was with a advice charity the other day where we were looking at how they can start to use AI to analyze their data more effectively, to understand where there's lack of provision for, say, legal aid, for example, and then where that could potentially start to be shaped into propositions for some of the work that they need to get funded. So there's loads of opportunities for charities to do more with their data using AI, which could be really helpful in meeting the needs of the communities they serve. But we're going to need the right partnerships to do it. In fact, I wrote a piece for the sector about this the other day, and I might just pop it in the show notes. But we need to start setting our stall out on this stuff as a sector now, rather than leaving it, because otherwise we really will get left behind.
And talking of which, we wanted to include a section from a conversation that we had last year. This is how busy this year has been, but we had a conversation last year with Alison Court, who's the Chief Transformation Officer at Oxfam. And in this clip, we discuss Oxfam's approach to incorporating AI technology into their work whilst addressing potential risks and opportunities. And I think she was really interesting, Alison, on the internal governance of AI, the support she's getting from the board, and then the broader implications of AI for charities. So we'll just run that clip and then we'll come back afterwards.
But I do think that civic society and charities need to be considering their own communities and what this might mean for those vulnerable communities that they support and serve. So that's the first part. The second part is, and yes, there are opportunities for Oxfam in incorporating those technologies in the way that we go about our work. So we already have, AI is already here, right? So it's rapidly being incorporated into some of the products and services that we already interact with in our technology stack. We have taken an approach of educating and training our staff about the risks and harms and use of AI, and where they use it individually, and also though giving them license to the use of AI on an individual basis if it doesn't use Oxfam data, etc., because there are some there will be inherent in our tools very, very soon. There'll be extensive AI that actually helps us do our jobs better and more effectively. But where it comes to a kind of systems use, or where they're using data that is proprietary, that is our community's data, then we put some very strict process and rules about how people go about ensuring that they've thought about safety in design, they've thought about the ethics of, they've thought about deploying it, they've thought about data privacy and protection, they've thought about human rights. And we signed it off with our board about 3-4 months ago now. We've called it an adaptive policy because we're going to need to look at it regularly, make sure that it's doing the job that it needs to do. And so the opportunity, the upside is it makes organisations like ours and people that work for us more efficient at doing their job, more efficient at contacting supporters, more efficient at communicating with donors, more efficient at delivering our programmatic work in countries, and but yeah, also need to be alive to the downsides and make sure that we are protecting both our organisations and, like I said, the individuals that we serve.
And those scenarios that you talked about there and how AI could, some of the negative impact of it could play out in your work. Can you give people a sense of what those scenarios could look like?
We've written it in our response. We've written the scenarios specifically where we're extrapolating really into the future, which is hard to see. But we've written, I think there's about 4 or 5 scenarios in our response to the white paper that are reasonably detailed, that say, and this is what we think the harm might be in, an humanitarian crisis context, for example. If the AI developed in the UK, deployed internationally, and is deployed on the basis of biased data, it just leads to decision making in health, in water, sanitation, etc., that is harmful to those communities. I'm not saying they're perfect. I think that we need to continue to consider those scenarios, and as the governance frameworks actually come to life and we start implementing them in the UK, but also we need to start thinking about the impact that will have on the people that charities are here to serve, and both the upside but also those downsides. But I'd encourage your listeners to go and read that response and look at the scenarios that we built, and see if it resonates with them in terms of the work that they're doing, because there are similarities to some of the communities that we work with, and poverty charities in the UK and the communities that they're working with. It's not dissimilar in some ways.
It's a really important exercise to do, isn't it? Something everyone should be considering as part of their scenario planning, I would have thought.
Yes, yeah.
So you talked about a paper or a presentation you made to the board to get agreement on the policies that you're taking forward. How are you structuring that internally? Is this becoming something that has a sort of a standalone committee, or is it a group task force or something to look at it? How are you dealing with that internal governance?
So the benefit for Oxfam is, and we might come on to this to talk about why I think it's important that tech leaders are at the top table, is that I'm at the top table. And so in terms of governance, we have a governance group internally in Oxfam that looks at technology governance and will consider the ethics and implementation of this type of technology. In terms of its pathway to the board, it was a board level discussion initially, and then we've also taken it to our audit and risk committee because of the cyber risk, is that and that's one of our top 3 risks. I think it probably is for lots of charities, and but also we want to have a risk lens on the way that we deploy that within Oxfam.
It gets tricky, doesn't it? Because once you put this technology, well, you're not even putting it in the hands of your employees. It becomes a little bit like the discussions we had within organisations 10, 15 years ago around social media and the impact that was going to have on individuals. You're not putting this stuff in their hands. They have it already.
We're fortunate in that our board representation is really broad, but we have people on our board who are digital leaders, who built digital businesses. And I think that's a real benefit. So I'm not saying that others are having to, but I'm not having to make the case for why this is important to our trustees. That they're already there and alongside us, and that's because of the breadth of experience that we have in that, and the advocates that we have for looking at this and considering our position already on our board.
That must be great to have that support, especially at such a time of really significant digital disruption.
Yes, I mean, invaluable. And like I said, it just means that before you even get to the board table, that there are people around that table who don't need to be sold the case on why this is important, but also have a really valuable contribution to make from their experiences of running digital businesses and what they feel that we need to consider. And so it's a really fruitful discussion. It was on our AI policy. We took a data strategy about 4 or 5 months ago. Similarly, really great supportive discussion, and they're already there alongside us. We're not having to make the case for this, as I know that some other charities do have to make a stronger case with their board on why this is important.
So following that clip and having listened to Alison's views, I just wonder, Zoe, what are the things that you want to leave charity leaders listening to this podcast today with as takeaways or actions that they can take into 2025? Best foot forwards in 2025, New Year's resolutions. What's the AI New Year's resolution that you're going to be asking charity leaders to run with in 2025?
Well, the big thing on our agenda at the moment is the update to the Charity Digital Code of Practice, which is going to include AI guidance for the first time, which I know we talked about a few episodes ago. But I hope that's going to go some way towards plugging this gap that we talked about with leadership and trustees, because the code is largely aimed at leaders and trustees and those who support them. And that will give charities, large and small, best practice on what they need to be doing in terms of AI and the strategy and the scrutiny and support they need to offer their charities. So what I'd say there, if you are someone who supports your board, you work with them, or a leadership team, you could start laying the path for the kinds of conversations that the updated code, which will be out in May of 2025, will help you have with them. And I hope that will create more support for the work a lot of our listeners are doing in terms of AI. So I would start having some of those introductory briefings now. So things like helping your leaders and your trustees understand what AI is, how it's relevant to them, how charities like yours and your competitors are using AI, what's coming down the track, just so they're warmed up, so that when the code lands, which I hope is going to be a really helpful resource for the sector, then you can really make the most of it, because they're kind of match fit and they're warmed up and you've put in the groundwork. They know what AI is and why it's relevant to them. And then you can really start to move forward by getting them to enact that best practice.
And having seen the guidance from last year, I don't think it's just for the charity sector either. I could literally lift it off the page and hand it to many organisations, mid-tier accountancy firms, mid-tier law firms, who could absolutely use exactly the same process and should be looking at it in that way to make sure that it's on the radar. So we'll wait for that with bated breath, and we'll share more of that when we get to it in May. And I would just say from my perspective as well, for 2025, I think there's got to be an intentionality about this now. And it's interesting because I'm helping an organisation at the moment with their 5-year strategy and their five-year strategy planning. And when we started to draft what that plan looked like on a page, for me, there were some things missing, and one of them was technology and AI. Another one was data, and another one was ESG. And I think there are challenges facing all businesses at the moment around all of those things. A lot of it is funding related. We've heard on this podcast about the challenges around ESG and why that needs to be brought back to the top table, I think. And I think a lot of that is around budgeting and the increased need for there's so much that organisations need to achieve today. But we really fought hard to make sure that those boxes were on the plan. And even if you feel that you cannot fill out the box that says AI in 2024 going into 2025, keep it there and keep asking that question about what do we need to fill that box with? Where does it have an impact? As you've absolutely said, which areas of our business is it going to affect? Who are the conversations that we who are the conversations with that we need to be having with our clients, with our people internally, so that there's an intentionality behind you building the next 5-year strategy with that embedded in it. Even if you don't know the answers today, how are you going to find out those answers? And I think your checklist and what you've done within the charity sector, as I said, I could do a direct lift of it. I could rebadge it and send it out into the private sector, and I think it would be just as helpful and just as useful for organisations to be looking at.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I totally agree with your point about intentionality, because we're at a point now where ever since ChatGPT got launched, God, 2 years ago, so many new tools have come on the market. As we were saying earlier, we've seen all this grassroots experimentation. We need to move to the point now where we're starting to make much more strategic choices and making the right decisions about where we're going to focus our efforts and investment. Otherwise, we're just going to hit this AI ceiling really quickly. So we need to start. This is about scaling now, and it's about setting the right strategies and really thinking through what we're going to do and what we're not going to do.
Yeah. And just as a little bit of fun, or to give our listeners a bit more of an appreciation for some of those tools that are starting to come to light, do you want to just share a couple that you use or have enjoyed using that we could include in the links and in the show notes and get people playing with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about Notebook LLM earlier, so I won't steal your thunder on that. But I'm a massive fan of Claude. I use Claude all the time. I found it really useful for things like qualitative user research, for helping me just think stuff through and write things, and for ideation. I found Gemini really useful for research and things like summarizing. I don't use ChatGPT as much as I did once because I think it can be quite sketchy, but occasionally it has a really good day and it's useful then. And we've got Gemini embedded into because we're built on Google Workspace as a business, and I generally have found that pretty helpful. So I find it hard to imagine my working day without AI in some form, to be honest.
Yeah, and I guess with ChatGPT, natively I don't use it, but we have to recognise that it's pretty much embedded in all of the AI that we're using. It's there. It's the cornerstone. Perplexity is one that I use on a daily basis, and have recommended to others who have also seen some really got some good use out of it. And I think the reason I like Perplexity is that it does include ChatGPT as an option that you can use, but it does a really good job at signalling its sources, and so you can use it as a research tool rather than an answers tool, if that makes sense. So I tend to ask it questions that I then delve into and add and build on the thread that I'm creating. As you've said, Notebook LM, and I think what we'll do at the end of this episode, so if you stay after our goodbyes, we'll include a short snippet of what Notebook LM can do. And I found that really useful in helping to prepare for podcasts, for example. Who are we talking to? What are the topics we're talking about? Is there a book that needs summarizing or something like that? So you can use it to summarize and create notes, guidance notes, study notes around a given subject, around a report. And you can also ask it to create a podcast, which is quite scary for you and me, Zoe. And although you can obviously tell that it is AI, it is very, very clever. And I think the clip that we'll include also can include jokes and include little quips and things that you just don't expect to hear an AI doing. So it is getting quite frightening that it might, we talked about replacing jobs. It might replace podcast hosts, and actually they might be more confident about doing it than we are.
Yeah, and sorry, I know we need to wrap up in a moment, but obviously there is that new podcast, isn't there, which I think is being launched imminently, where it's like an AI Michael Parkinson that's going to be interviewing celebrities, and I don't know how I feel about that. I think it's really challenging ethical territory, really challenging.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a big conversation in 2025, because it started to emerge at the end of this year, especially in some of the professions that I work with, and it's a very different conversation depending on what side of the fence you sit. So, for example, I don't think marketing people see as much of a risk; they see more opportunity with AI, whereas internal communication people I work with are seeing a little bit more on the, well, actually I'm a crafts person. I create, I write, and this is yes, it can give me ideas, but it could start to impinge on my territory. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how we assess that risk and assess that need to identify our sources, and identify that this section, the end section of this podcast today, will have been delivered through Notebook LM. It is definitely not me and Zoe, and hopefully our listeners vote with their ears and come back to listen to the real us in our future episodes, and don't demand that we do more episodes through Notebook LM. But it's worth including just to see how far it has come. No, a great conversation. I hope our listeners found it useful, and we will include links in the show notes to some of the resources that we've talked about, and we'll see you on the next episode of Starts at the Top.
See you on our next episode. Thanks, everyone.